We're live.
Yeah. I did not see Commissioner Dumble.
Oh, I'm back here. I'm hiding in the
Oh my God, there you are. You're hiding behind Senator Norris.
Whenever we can just hide and be quiet, that's our preferred.
Okay, I think you're our first witness this morning, Commissioner. Welcome. We're looking, when we had our backlog meeting, court backlog meeting last week, we didn't get to you because of time constraints. Certain people talk longer than we expected.
Thank you, don't worry.
But a number of issues have come up where there's been committee members with questions about certain situations within the corrections. So I think Ben sent you a list of the questions, but you can then, you want to remind us of what some of those questions were, please?
Just keep moving along. Okay.
One at a paper.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Ben Obrowski from the Office of Legislative Counsel. The list of questions were, what are the savings between keeping someone incarcerated and someone under the supervision of DOC? The annual cost of incarceration an individual incurs through in-state contracts compared to out-of-state contracts. How many people are held without bail? How many people are held without bail because they cannot pay? Update on DLS violations, and how many referrals to programs related to restorative justice approaches to our criminal justice system. Not all of those, I think, are in your wheelhouse, Commissioner, but the ones that are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start with the cost of incarceration. In-state, out-of-state, specialized units, whatever.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Demmel. I'm the Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Corrections. I have a couple of our team with us today. Kristen Calvert, who's our Finance Director, and Isaac Dano, who is our Head for Policy and Strategy in the department. We have a slide with us that breaks down the cost of incarceration. I think it's a sound methodology, and Kristen can talk us through that if you have questions about it. But I will caveat this by saying I'm a little reticent to discuss incarceration in this way, because I think that the number can be a bit misleading. You know, in Vermont, we're a small state. We have a small correction system. It's a unified system, which is unique to Vermont. There's only, I think, 4 other states in the country who have a unified system, meaning anybody who's in any type of detention in the state of Vermont, from pretrial detention all the way through long-term sentences, is housed with the state. There's no county jail system. There's no local lockups. And, you know, we have, interestingly, we have a system that has a very low correctional officer to incarcerated individual ratio. So all of those things contribute to having a fairly expensive per incarcerated individual cost to them. We estimate that number to be, as you can see, somewhere around $95,000. But that we try to factor into that number, you know, the administrative costs of the department as well. And so it's not simply how much does it cost to house, feed, and provide medical services. It's a bigger encapsulation of the total cost of the system. You juxtapose that against our out-of-state contract. Obviously, there's a huge delta there of nearly $50,000. But again, I feel like that's a bit misleading because that is really just the cost of a contract, and we're paying a per diem rate for individuals to be housed out of state. We don't have to incur the total cost of their administration of a facility or their system, because that's defrayed over multiple customers. And then we looked at what the per capita cost in the field is, and that number is obviously very low. I mean, really, the touch points for an individual in community supervision are pretty few, and we can spread that among a much larger group. And so that number comes at just under 10,000. Happy to talk about some of that, or any of that, or if there's specific areas you'd like us to dig in on.
Go ahead, Senator.
I have a question that's a holdover from, might have been a joint justice oversight hearing that I've had in my mind. So this goes to the out-of-state prisoners. And if I'm remembering right, we're down to below 150.
Yeah.
But when we talked about it that last time, you said, and correct me if I'm misremembering, you said we'll never get to zero.
Under our current construct,
Yeah.
I think that's right.
And then I saw in some news reporting that the current contract you were looking at would allow up to 300 prisoners out of state. So my question is, why, since we've shrunk the out-of-state population, now clearly there's a financial incentive,
Right.
but I think the legislature's been pretty clear about the moral incentive that we want, if at all possible, when possible, to bring everybody back in state. So first of all, why would we never reach zero? And second of all, why would we be contracting for up to 300?
Yeah. Excellent question, Senator. So let me give you just a touch of background on the contract itself. We currently have a contract for 300. The state budgets for 160 of those beds. So we have a contract for 300. We only pay for what we use. We only budget 160, knowing we hopefully will never use the 300. And of those, I think today we're at around 110 total out-of-state population. The delta between the amount we use and that 160 is that out-of-state bed savings we recapture and spend just on justice reinvestment projects. There's a couple of reasons we have such a large contract, the 300 beds. That is, historically, we did have that many folks out of state. I think at our highest point, this is probably 15 to 20 years ago, we were somewhere around 700 out-of-state incarcerated individuals. That number has decreased significantly over time, but especially in the last few years. And I think a lot of that is reflections of justice reinvestment work taking root. We're getting people out of the system in Vermont, which frees up space. We're able to bring folks back. The primary reason today that we still have a contract for 300 is as an emergency release valve for our system. So our system in Vermont is maxed out. We have oversubscribed the facilities that we have. We have more incarcerated individuals than we have space for them. If we lost a facility to a natural disaster or some major maintenance issue, it didn't have water anymore or something, we really have no flexibility in our current system to move individuals out of one facility to another. And so in the event that we had a catastrophic failure of a facility, we have that release valve currently in Mississippi, the out-of-state contract, where we can move up to 300 individuals at that time.
Okay, and just to follow on there. So during the pandemic to now, we dropped some hundreds of prisoner population. I would say 500, something like that.
Probably greater than that.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, why are we maxed out now, but we had capacity for 500 more? You see what I'm saying?
Well, we also have more people out of state. So
Well, we were at 500 more.
No, that's true. That's true. There's a couple of different factors that have changed over the last couple of years.
Yep.
The way we use our facilities has changed slightly. So we didn't have dedicated quarantine isolation space before. We have to do that now. We have greater individuals with greater needs. And so our colleagues, some of our staff later today, I think or tomorrow, is testifying in House Corrections about the types of beds we have. So every bed in our system is not created equal, right? There are general population beds, there are close custody beds, infirmary beds, special mental health beds. And so those beds have also been utilized more in the last few years than they had been in the past. We're seeing an older population, a sicker population, a more violent population, frankly, which is bad on the whole, but is good if you look at it through the lens of justice reinvestment. It means the folks that are incarcerated today are the folks who are a danger to the community or are unable to be reasonably supervised in the community. They're not your like DUI case or some of these less dangerous public safety cases. On top of that, our system is the way it is constructed is a bit antiquated. The newest facility is 20 plus years old at this point. And so we have inherent limitations on how much we can flex the facilities.
Can I ask, this seems to me just on its face to present an incentive, if subconscious, an incentive to move people out of state because you can then use the beds that are freed up here for the sorts of other uses that you're talking about, as well as save money, which then goes into increased programming in the community. But I feel like in the last few years, we've lost the sense of urgency about bringing all the out-of-state prisoners home. And so it was dismaying to me to hear you say that we would never do that, because that seems to me a direction that's being set from the top, where we're saying that regardless of circumstance, we're going to have this contract in Mississippi, and we're going to be moving people there, not only in the event of an emergency, but under normal conditions.
So,
Can I just interject? Historically, we had about 1,300 beds in the system, in state, and then we've had up to 700 out of state in my time. So that was like 2,000 people incarcerated. Two things happened. One is we sharply reduced the out-of-state beds through the first justice reinvestment, and now the second one, but also the pandemic reduced the out-of-state beds. So we were before the pandemic, I believe we were about 300 out of state. We're now down to 100 and something. What also happened was the quarantines and so forth, but also the specialized beds. As the prison population got older, this is before you arrived, Commissioner, I think there was more of a direction to try to reduce. So I think we may be down to 1,100 and something beds because of the specialized. So we've lost a couple. I know my numbers are just rough,
you're in the ballpark.
but I think we've lost about 200 in-state beds by specializing in various groups, which maybe, when I read about Springfield having problems, I say, well, maybe that's because we put a lot of specialty groups there too.
It is. I mean, I think.
I think we need to look at the whole system. But I agree with Senator Baruth. The goal was to eventually eliminate the use of out-of-state beds, except for those people, law enforcement officer who gets arrested and, prosecutor gets, has to go to jail. You don't want him in jail. Places where he's put people, where he or she. So you're always going to have a certain number that need to be out of state. But in terms of a, contract, that's where I would agree with that. The goal was to eliminate the need for out-of-state beds. But we have to keep in mind that we did lose a certain number of in-state beds in the process of specializing.
So let me clarify, because I understand the logic of the question and why you think maybe that's the direction we're going. I want to be very clear. The position of the administration and of the department itself is, the goal is to get to 0 out-of-state beds. We don't want, we would rather house Vermonters in Vermont. We know the standards that we keep. We want to bring those folks back. When I say that it's unlikely to happen, never is probably too strong a word. It's unlikely to happen. What I mean is it's unlikely to happen unless there is a major change in our system. we change a facility, build a new facility that can house more folks, or we change the way we house people in our system. That's hard because of the physical limitation. Or there's some major change to our population. We've seen that, to Senator Seuss's point, we've seen a pretty precipitous decline in our population. My best guess is we're kind of plateauing now. And I can show either in this meeting or another how the population has changed over time. In terms of total population has significantly decreased, but also the population we're serving has changed dramatically. They are the violent sentence population, high risk scores, folks who habitually violate terms of probation, parole, furlough, and can't reasonably be supervised. And while that trend has been happening, while our risk scores and the violence level goes up, our recidivism rate has stayed level, which means we are positively impacting recidivism in the state. The populations that are hardest to serve are not recidivating at a higher level, which is, I think, a good thing overall. We've done some really nice work in the last 5 years or so to make that happen. There's also some hidden pieces to the data. So, for example, today we have 100 or so women at CRCF at our facility in South Burlington. That facility used to house 170 individuals. But if you went through CRCF today and looked in every cell, every housing unit, you would say it looks full. I mean, there's a couple people in each room, and it's well populated. But historically, we were housing almost 70 more people than we are today. So that means people were tripled up, or there were 4 people in a room. It means people were living in spaces, a gym or other space that wasn't purposefully designed for housing. We have worked to try to fix that across the system so that people are housed in as comfortable an environment as we can create, that they're not 4 people to a room, that we're not using gymnasiums unless there's some catastrophic event. We did use some of that during COVID to protect and isolate and move folks around the system, because that's the only option we had. But I think, could we house 110 more people in our system? Yes, but it would not be a good situation in the state.
And I'll just end, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just end by saying, I personally would appreciate if there was going forward a continued effort to reduce the number of out-of-state beds. And maybe that doesn't get to 0, but maybe it gets us to 50 or 30 or something like that. So just a way of saying that focus that we had 3 or 4 years ago under a previous pro tem, it's called the ASH Challenge at that point. And I think we've done great work since then. Your department's done great work. So just a word that I personally would love to see it continue.
Yeah, and you have my commitment that our position is we want to reduce that population as low as we possibly can, bring them back to Vermont, and we'll keep trying to do that under some of the restrictions, the limitations that we have.
One of the shocking things to me was a couple of years ago, I had about 5 people that I knew who were out of state, and arranged a phone call with them. And to a person, they were happier out of state than in state.
Well, it's
We're not supposed to think that they would be, but and I knew them when they were kids, obviously. But it was just surprising to me that they preferred the out of state. They were doing long sentences, and they felt just as comfortable out of state. Not in Pennsylvania, by the way. That was where the problem came in. the head of the Corrections Department in Pennsylvania at the time was the chair of the Justice Center Advisory Board. And just after we terminated the contract with Pennsylvania, we had an advisory board meeting. He said, oh, well, don't worry about it. We got Delaware.
Yeah. So
But it's surprising that they are not necessarily opposed to being out of state.
quite the contrary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually just in Mississippi. So I went and visited the facility. I think I'm the first commissioner to do that in at least 10 years. But definitely the first one to visit our Mississippi facility. And I sat and did a town hall, a small group with the incarcerated population down there. We also did surveys of that population to try to understand, you know, what's going right, what's going wrong. And overwhelmingly, the population says they do not want to return to Vermont, which is interesting. That's not a reason not to bring it back. But I think to your point, Senator, it's an interesting dynamic.
Why did they say?
It's a bigger facility, so the rooms are bigger, the day rooms are bigger. They have room to kind of spread out. They have creature comforts that we don't offer here, like video games and some of those kind of creature comforts. Because we're a unified system, we have detainees and sentenced individuals, and that creates some tension. So if you're serving a 30-year sentence and your roommate or the guy in the next cell over is here for 3 days, you can see how there could be some conflict there. And you know, detainees bend younger, the sentenced population bends a little older. And so everybody who's in Mississippi is serving a long sentence. And so there's a bit of a social contract that, you know, everybody kind of keeps the temperature down. They're there for a long time. You don't want to make enemies. You don't want to create conflict. And so there's less churn. It's I think, a little more peaceful environment. And so all these factors.
They said the staff was more consistent.
Interesting. The only thing I heard that they said they liked more about Vermont was the food, which is funny because if you go around the Vermont facilities, nobody will tell you the food is good. So I thought that was kind of an interesting outcome, but we'd be happy to share that survey data with you so you can see it. And we've been trying to do more of that to really get a better pulse on our staff, but also the populations we're serving down there. I think Senator Lewis had a earlier.
Yes, just out of curiosity, Commissioner, I realize that the goal is to get as many people as we can back into Vermont. I was wondering what the criteria was for sending or displacing people out of the state. And the reason that I asked that is, say if you got 10 detainees, of which you send 8 out of state, and they just, for some strange reason, we don't want to send anybody, but they happen to be residents of Vermont, where their families and everything are here. We send them to Missouri, and we keep maybe 2 out-of-state individuals whose families aren't here. Is that all taken into consideration?
A little bit. So the broad stroke criteria is you have to be serving a long sentence. You're not eligible for any programming. You don't have any pending court cases or matters in Vermont. And you're currently not on our medically assisted treatment program. So that limits the available population who could be sent pretty significantly. And the reason for that is if you had court cases or you're about to be released, you need to come back and prepare for that. And bringing folks back and forth is challenging. And so we're really looking at that population of long-term incarcerated and doesn't meet any of those other criteria. We are going to change, we're working to change the MAT eligibility criteria. The reason for that historically was that Vermont was one of the only correction systems that provided MAT. Now both other states and private companies are catching up and wanting to offer MAT.
And that would be MAT for, I don't know what that is.
I'm sorry, it's a medically assisted treatment program. It's basically a treatment program for folks who are having opioid substance use. And historically that was provided many places other than Vermont, maybe a couple of states. We're changing that because that's limiting who can go and who has to stay now that companies and states are willing to provide that. So it doesn't, often it doesn't really matter whether they were a Vermont resident or an out-of-state resident, because the population we're looking at is pretty small.
So I have a couple questions, but as a follow-up, who would be in our system that is ineligible for any of our programming?
So some programming kind of kicks in, or you become eligible for a certain period of time before your release date. And so we could bring in kind of the suite of programming that's available to folks, but part of it is a limitation of resources. We just don't have resources to provide 100% programming to 100% of the population. So we have to kind of, organize an order of need, who need what programming when. So that would typically limit who is eligible for programming. If you're not being released for 15 years, you may not be eligible for programming until a few years before your release date.
It's just concerning if we're trying to build a more restorative system that we are not offering programming and support to everyone within the system. So that certainly gives me pause. How many? So you said that the people being incarcerated are bending towards more violence, but that assumedly is not everyone is there for a violent crime. What percentage would you say is incarcerated for a non-violent event?
Well, we'd have to break down separately by detainees and sentenced population. So we have about 500 detainers today. Of those, I think around 50 are incarcerated for non-violent or largely non-violent offenses. Everyone else is detained on a violent charge, or it's DUI 7 or something, long, habitual reoffense. In the sentenced population, I think I have that. So in 2022, this is a point in time look, so bear with me, but 60% of the population is sentenced on a serious felony crime. To give you some context, 5 years earlier than that, that number was 50%. So we've seen a pretty precipitous increase in the number of serious felony charges or sentences.
And that's by design.
Yes, yeah, certainly. I think that is a direct reflection of the work we've been doing through Justice
That
Rehabilitation.
does make for a more difficult population.
Definitely. And it's changing in other ways too. I mentioned illness, age, like the state of Vermont, we have an aging incarcerated population.
When the senator asked about programming, I understand that some programs are maybe 12 months or 18 months in duration. So if you have a 10-year sentence, you wouldn't want to start them right then. But I think one of the things that we're lacking in our system is things for people to do.
Yeah, definitely.
And yesterday I was in Senate Appropriations, and the witness chair is now an old Windsor chair. And I commented on the Windsor chair. Senator Kitchell, of course, remembers the Windsor chair. And Senator Perchlik asked, well, what's a Windsor chair? I said, well, they were made in Windsor when there was a prison there. And they used to make chairs. And it dawned on me that we don't have the industries that we once had that kept offenders occupied. And I think that something we should be looking at, frankly, as we continue to, that isn't a form of programming when you're doing something, usefully, but it's making Windsor chairs.
I appreciate that you previewed that. This session, the department intends to present a proposal to the legislature of a redesign of our vocational training program, really to target that exact problem. The industries that we had historically really aren't serving the population now. They're also not teaching skills that are in high demand in the communities. And so to capture both of those needs, we've spent the last couple of years using a federal grant to rethink how vocational services are provided in the facilities. And with a real intent to move away from a business model and move towards a vocational training, kind of like the career training centers that we have out in the communities, bring those right into the facility.
Just to think we were thinking the same.
I know, it's shocking, isn't it?
It is shocking, Commissioner.
To go back one step though, when I talk about programming in this context, what I mean is programs that are required under the individual's sentence or need to successfully complete before they're allowed to go out. So the quickest one that comes to mind is sex offender programming. There's requirements under law that they must go through programming before they're eligible to be released. And that's the type of, that's why it's usually connected to their release timeline. So it would be before their minimum sentence, they have to complete the programming in order to be eligible. And some people just opt not to do programming, but then they're ineligible for release until they complete it or hit their maximum sentence.
If someone wanted to do that programming earlier, I, as a mental health provider, I know that people are most accessible to that when they're ready to do it. Would they be able to do it earlier?
It's a good question. I don't exactly know the answer. I mean, I think in some circumstances, possibly. Largely, though, it's a resource issue. We have limited programming resources available to us that we can offer. And so we need to prioritize the folks who are, needing that to get released. We don't hold people back because we didn't provide programming. If they opt not to take it, that's a personal decision. But we want to make sure that we're offering it to those folks. And so we wouldn't prioritize somebody who's volunteering to take it, but it wouldn't be useful not useful, that's not the right word, but it wouldn't impact their release for 5 years when we have an individual who needs it in order to get released in the next year or so.
And then just another sort of thinking about the population, how much of the population is there because of substance use or mental health challenges?
I can tell you the population that has substance use challenges. There, because of substance use challenges, I think we could probably get an answer. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can tell you that 1 in every 2 incarcerated individuals in Vermont has a substance use disorder. So if you're walking through a prison in Vermont, every other person you interact with has a substance use issue, which is, in my opinion, just very, very scary.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly we know there's a lack of community resources to support substance use disorder.
But to be clear, not all of those folks are there because of their substance use issues. It can be co-occurring to other issues that are going on. Some of it is related to their criminal activity that resulted in incarceration, but it is extremely troubling to me.
We've got about 25 minutes left, so move to the court backlog.
Sure. So you all had a discussion last week with the House Judiciary Committee talking about the court backlog. We have some data that I'd like to show you, but I also wanted to just add a component to the conversation that I think is important. I heard Judge Zone's testimony last week and some of the others as well talk about the struggles they're having to combat kind of the backlog problem, staffing struggles, resource problems, technology limitations, and I empathize. And Judge Zone and I and Judge Zone and my team and his team have worked really closely to muddle through some of this and try to figure out some of how it's impacting the correction system as well. But one thing I do want to highlight is, in addition to the courts that Judge Zone is helping to administer, we have 6 other courts in the state that we kind of forget about, and those are our correction system. Each one of our prisons in Vermont is basically running a courthouse. We have technology that's provided by the court system, but we have 1,300 justice-involved individuals who usually have involvement with the criminal court system, also with the family court system, potentially also with the civil court system. And we are trying to facilitate their access to the courts. And the burden, the impact that's having on the correction system, I think can't be overstated. We have caseworkers, the very individuals who help set up programming, who help get people ready for release, serving as de facto court staff to help people get to their court appointment, explain what's happening, give them paperwork. which is preventing them from doing the core release planning work that they're assigned. We have, the technology is limited. The screens are small. It's difficult for people in the correction system to understand or hear or see what's happening in their court proceedings. We historically have tried to assist with transports. You heard a little about that last week. But there's nowhere in Vermont state law that says the Department of Corrections should be doing that. We've done it because we want to be helpful. We can't do it anymore. We just don't have the staff. I mean, I know the courts are suffering from staffing challenges, as many institutions are, but so is the correction system. Over the summer, we had, among our security staff, those staff who work in the corrections facilities, we had a 30% vacancy. We've worked really hard to bring that down to under 25% in the last several months, which I think is a testament to the plans that we put in place to address that. But that's still 25% are missing from the system. And that impacts the populations that we have as well and how we serve them. But then we take on this other burden of trying to help people get through courts. And to be clear, this is not just the judiciary, and it's nobody's fault, but it's not just the judiciary's impact. Defense counsel also asked for favors, asked for paperwork to be printed off, asked for, hey, can you give this to my client instead of coming to the facilities to visit? And it's the lack of available transports. And so what happens when an individual gets arrested overnight, they get arraigned in the morning and released by the judge? Now, they may be from Derby and they're in Newport. Well, how are they gonna work, who moves them? And I can go on and on and on about the impacts this is having, but I just can't overstate enough. We're totally underwater on this stuff. And so our team has worked with Judge Zone and his team to try to massage out some of these problems and work through potential solutions. But we also are increasingly having to say no and put up safeguards for our system to say we can only do court during these hours.
If I could, that was exactly where my question was going. So when Judge Zone testified in our joint hearing, one of the things that I found most shocking was that ADS was not providing adequate bandwidth or something for the equipment to operate. And so you were actually migrating from there with a request to us to fund that. That's on ADS, and they should be aware that they're, I don't want to say losing customers, because they're supposed to be providing basic infrastructure within government around IT. So that's a fail that's on state government. But the other piece is, and I think Senator Sears has been great about finding gaps in funding and going to appropriations, because he is sitting on both, as do I, and plugging in funds for things like this. So you mentioned that in the prison system, the equipment that you have to work on is inadequate. People can't see properly, which is obviously impacting their justice involved experience. So is there an ask in the offing to deal with that particular piece?
So that equipment is provided by the judiciary. So I don't want to.
But clearly it needs upgrading.
I don't want to step on Commissioner Devil's time, but Tom Zone, Chief Superior Judge, we have, it's been ordered, it's been evaluated. They've actually been starting to work on putting it in. This was identified as an issue, so the judiciary did take steps months ago. Some of it was, like with many of the areas of technology, actually waiting to get it because of delays. That has been something that Commissioner Devil's team and our team have been working on and are moving forward on.
Okay,
absolutely.
Good to hear.
And Senator Sears asked a question in last week's hearing about how COVID relief money, and forgive me if that's not the proper name, but money that came in during the pandemic was used for these situations. And I think, Judge Zone explained artfully how the judiciary has used that funds. I think the state's attorneys and sheriffs got some. The Department of Corrections did not get COVID relief money for the judicial impact or the backlog of the courts. And yet we have, I think, the largest concentration of individuals who are being served by the court system. And I'm not saying that's the reason this is all happening, but I am highlighting, I think, that it gets forgotten about, that we have 1,300 plus individuals who need access to the courts, and we're trying to facilitate some of that. And the courts have been good at trying to work through that with us, but the impact is enormous still, and there's not an end in sight.
I do have a kind of an odd question. Back when Springfield was built, I still can't remember it, southeast, right?
Southern. Southeast is the.
When Springfield was built, there was put in there the Paul Hudson, who's one of my favorite judges over the years, by the way, the Paul Hudson courtroom. Why couldn't we have court in the prison? Let the lawyers, the judges, and everybody come there. You don't need the technology because they'll be in person. Is there a reason we're not doing that? And Judge Zoney may have some great reasons for not doing it, but I know that that was envisioned at the time that Springfield was built.
I don't know the reason that that's not happening. I have a couple of guesses. I'll let the judge talk about the judiciary part of that. From the correction side, I mean, we have space that we could use, you know, it could be ad hoc space, like a visitor room.
And I visited various correctional centers, and I could see that it might be a problem. For example, in Rutland, I ended up usually using the deputy superintendent's office.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could do it. There's some natural logistical limitations. Who do you have court for? Is it arraignments? Is it, you know, what is the proceeding that's being handled there? But I mean, I think, you know, we'd be open to any solution at this point because it's, I don't think.
I think it's worth considering, you know, it solves a few problems, and also the lawyer would be there. I assume a state's attorney would be there. It would take cooperation amongst the state's attorneys. So, for example, if the case was in Springfield, and it's a Bennington person, it'd probably be somebody from Windsor County representing the state.
And it's one of our challenges of having kind of regionally centered correction systems and not a county lockup and then a county court that are, you know, right next to.
Anyway, it's just worth.
So we're working through that. But like I said, I think we're increasingly running into our limitations and having to say, we can't help you with this. And Judge Zoney, to his credit, has been really good about working with us on that. It's challenging when we have kind of a confederation of courts because each judge is able to do, you know, within their authority, kind of their own thing. And there's some disparity that happens as it impacts our correction system. So I wanted to flag that. I also wanted to share a little data. I know we're running short on time, but I think if we can go to the next slide.
By the way, these slides are all on the webpage.
This depicts, the pink bar is really the focus. This depicts state detainers. So these are individuals who have not been adjudicated and not been sentenced. Starting in Q1 of 2019, the line there is kind of the beginning of COVID, just to give you some orientation. And you can see steadily the pink line, that's the number of detainers in the state, is increasing. I put the blue bar on here. Those are our federal detainers. I put that on there simply to highlight that that is not impacting the total. That's not the reason that this is going up. And that's because we have a contract with the federal government that caps the number that they can send to us. The pink bar is increasing. Yes.
Can I ask you a question about the trend lines, or is that something you're about to get into?
I don't know.
Yeah, what's the question? So, you know, I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to why Q2 in 2020, there's, you know, that's the lowest number for detainers, and you know, it rises a bit, drops down, and then now presently I can't see the number, but over 400. Yeah.
So Q2 of 2020, that's the first quarter after COVID begins.
And so
I think that you see everybody going to ground. right?
Right.
The court stopped,
Right, okay.
slowed down, I should say. Everything kind of slowed down. I think Q1, Q2 of 21, I'm not sure why there's a dip there. We could dig into that data a little bit, but in general, you're seeing the trend line creep up.
And those are primarily more so violent offenders as we're getting into Q3 and Q4, is that?
Throughout, I think you would see that the violence level didn't change a ton.
Okay.
I'm looking at it, I wouldn't be surprised if it tracks with the spikes in COVID.
I think
So,
you're probably right.
yeah, so if you look Q4, I remember that summer and into the winter, everybody was like, oh, we're free again. Then it hit November, everybody locked down
Yeah.
for those two quarters. Then the weather gets warmer again, you go back up.
And as you get further away from the line, COVID becomes, I think, less of an impact on the system.
Yeah,
So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to break this out by gender also, by sex, because in general, the number of female detainees in the system also doesn't change dramatically. And so what we're seeing is male detainees are increasing, but females stay largely the same. And this is a look just at, this is both federal and state.
But that's the highest number of female detainees in Q4 of all of the, it's ranged from
Right, so a slight uptick towards the most recent time frame.
range from 30 to, actually not, 28 to 50. So it's fairly consistent, and there's a total of 100 population in South Bronx.
Yeah, a little over 100 today. So if we
And
go,
half of them are detainees.
yeah, over 40, so
That's
nearly
be
half.
of concern. Should be of concern.
And the other thing I would highlight, I know many of you have been around the system for a while, so forgive me if I'm saying something you already know, but the correction system has no impact on who is detained in our system. We can do some things with sentenced individuals. We can use furlough, we get people on presumptive parole. We have some tools in our toolkit to use, but we do not decide who is detained.
You can't put up a no vacancy sign.
Right. And we can't control whether that goes up 20% tomorrow or down 20% tomorrow. And so that really limits our flexibility as a system. But related to that, I wanted to show you the next slide, which is the sentenced population. So before we were talking about detainees, that number is going up. The sentenced population, you can see, has precipitously declined, and we hope we can hold at where we're at and not let it creep back up. And I think it's interesting because Justice Reinvestment 2 was taking effect, I think, just as COVID was kicking off. So there's a couple of different things happening here, but I really do think the reason we've been able to stay stable is Justice Reinvestment taking root within the correction system, which we're very proud of.
No,
And then the last one is just the trend lines to the senator's earlier question. The top is the sentenced population, the bottom is the detained population. You can see how they've moved over time.
very helpful. We had, this is extremely helpful. May seem redundant in some ways, but it's helpful to see the charts and the numbers and where they're going. And see that some of the things we do working together do have an impact. And it's a credit to the administration, to the judiciary, and I think the legislature, the Justice Reinvestment stuff. And it does have an impact, but it doesn't have an impact on the detained population. And I think there were questions about bail that we haven't gotten to. We can use the last few minutes to see if we can refresh our minds. we didn't really talk about the bail, and who's being detained for what. What was the question?
How many people are held?
You may want to ask.
They were my questions. And I was raising my hand to do it because we didn't get to it. It's like you read my mind. I'm wondering how many people are being detained without bail.
So I think largely, if I might, that's primarily a question for the.
I thought it might be, which is why
I
I
will
was
relinquish
Hand off, George.
Chair.
Judge,
Good morning. For the record, Tom Zone, Chief Superior Judge. And I would give credit to the Department of Corrections because this data we actually got from DOC. So thank you. It was, his staff is great. As of January 13th, it says 230 individuals were held without bail. It showed a total detainee population on January 13th of 420. I believe today that number is 445. Commissioner Devil has a staff member who every morning sends out to a group what those numbers are. And so that number this morning, I think, was 440.
And they're on the website updated too.
Okay. That I was unaware of, but because I get it personally sent to my inbox, and it starts my day.
These are some of the privileges of being.
It's at like 5 a.m. Josh Rutherford sends it out.
before you have your coffee, you
Before anything, and I actually look forward to it. If it's late, I'm going, where is it?
See, I have to log in and check it every morning. So there, as of January 13th, there were 190 people that were not being held without bail. So why are they being detained?
The data shows that it also breaks it down by lack of cash bail. There was 14 who had bail imposed of less than $1,000, 55 apparently between 1,000 and 9,999, 70 over 10,000 to 100,000. That's a big range, but that's the statistic. There were 5 that were in the hundreds of thousands, and there were 29 came up as unknown. I don't know what that category is. And then there was, it said 15 that looks like they were waiting for release to a responsible adult.
Okay. So all but 15 of those individuals are being detained because they can't post bail.
Have not posted bail.
Okay.
There may be other reasons why. Many of them simply can't post bail. Some may have charges or detainers from other states that they would not want to post bail because then they'd be extradited possibly, but that's not a large number, I suspect.
Can I just ask, at the higher end, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and this is a judge question, is the intention ever to keep them in jail by making the bail high enough that they probably can't?
The sole legitimate purpose of bail is to minimize the risk of flight from prosecution. And it's not to hold someone in jail. It's constitutionally, bail is not for public safety.
Yeah.
Bail is to make sure someone shows up for court. So under our criteria, under Title 13, Section 7554, the bail decision by a judge should be, how much money is it going to take that if it is put up, this person will show up for court?
but I thought that we had a provision that allowed consideration of the dangerousness of the person based on the weight of evidence.
There is, under our Constitution and statutes, under Title 13, Section 7553A, there is a hold without bail that can be imposed on someone who has a crime with an element
Without bail.
without bail.
Okay.
That's correct.
As opposed to putting $1 million bail on somebody who
Again,
probably could only come up with $100.
correct. That we've had decisions by the Supreme Court that have said that while bail need not absolutely be attainable, it has to be in a number that bears some relation to the person's potential of flight to avoid prosecution. You cannot impose bail to say, I want to impose $1 million because I want to make sure this person doesn't get out of jail. That's not a valid imposition.
You would have to prove the dangerousness and the weight of evidence is great.
If the state is seeking to hold someone without bail, they can do that under Section 7553, which is a life imprisonment case. There's also cases where it's a felony, a crime with an element of violence, and the court concludes by clear and convincing evidence that no condition or combination of conditions is reasonably going to assure the safety of any person. Those would be the two hold without bails. On the latter one, the court, on both, the court would have what's called a weight of the evidence hearing. And the court would still go through the factors to determine whether it concludes it should exercise discretion to release the person. If the court concludes, for instance, in the hold without bail under 7553A of the felony crime of violence, that no conditions can be imposed and holds the person, under the law, they are entitled to have trial commenced within 60 days unless they waive that right.
So if at the maximum amount, let's say $500,000, that would likely be because the person is a flight risk, but not a safety risk, and has the means to produce freedom for themselves by putting up.
Someone can be a flight risk and a safety risk. In other words, they're not mutually exclusive. I say that
Understood.
because
But if they're a safety risk, they might be held, just held. I'm talking about somebody who's not a hold without bail, somebody who's just in the bail category, but it's a very, very high bail. You're saying it's not to keep them in prison, it's to make sure that they show up to get their money back. So I guess what I'm saying is that person would most likely be somebody of means who seems as though they might not come back unless there's a big incentive to do so.
it would depend on the specific facts. Under 7554, there's a number of factors the court can consider when determining what the risk of flight may be and for the imposition of bail. And their financial resources is a factor that you would consider. So I can't say that in every case there's someone of means. The court may feel that they have the opportunity to get it. They might not have the money in the bank. They might not have the hard assets, but the court may determine that that's the amount that needs to be put up to assure them of the hearing.
I think we should have bail lessons. You know, I don't hear anything more frustrating to me anyway. Constantly reading about this catch and release and why didn't this person get held? I think there's a lack of general understanding of bail, and it gets confused by efforts to reform bail in this state and other states. And I just it's really hard to explain to constituents why the judge let them go.
And as each of the members of this committee know, as the judge, you explain your decisions through the written product or on the record. When someone says, well, the judge should hold that person on bail because they're dangerous. Well, the purpose of bail is not for the dangerous side. If they're entitled to be held without bail, yes, the judge can do that. But absent that, the judge has to consider the least restrictive conditions and bail.
Judge, I was just wondering, for the weight of evidence hearing, what's the threshold of evidence that the state has to prove to meet what they're looking for the hold without bail?
It's the same standard that's under Rule 29 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure, or Rule 12D when you're looking at dismissal. And that is, the court has to consider the evidence, the evidence in the light most favorable to the state and excluding modifying evidence. And it has to view that for admissible evidence. In other words, at that stage, the state has to prove that it has admissible evidence to go forward.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Judge Zonay or Commissioner Dunn? I thank you both of you very much. It's been enlightening, and but you know, oftentimes we don't see the results of some of our efforts, but as I said earlier, it's nice to see at least the sentence population reduced significantly. Senator.
Excuse me, I just wanted, I know it was brought up as far as holding court in the correctional facilities. They wanted to get the judge's opinion or thoughts on that.
I would, my quick reaction is no. Individuals who are being held oftentimes have enough trouble trusting the system, let alone having the very facility that is holding them become the courtroom. I think it would be structurally difficult to get attorneys to go into the courthouses. You don't know, when we do remote hearings, you may have a person being lodged up in Chittenden County and yet their case is in Orange County. You're not going to get attorneys who are willing to do that. Attorneys generally have taken the job to go to court. not to go to jails. And as actually, as Commissioner Demo points out, one of the difficulties is many of the attorneys have not been going to the jails to visit clients and are trying to rely on DOC personnel. I also think from a just structure in the day, you would actually probably add to the backlogs, because as opposed to having a centralized place, you would be going into the facility and you're solving one problem, but you're adding another because the judge is gone from the building. You're going to be having the travel time to get to that in the midday. You're going to have difficulty deciding what cases are going to be put on. You're going to possibly be bringing many attorneys in. You're also going to have probably the entire prosecutor's office there, because they don't all handle cases for each other necessarily. Plus, what do you do when there's a hearing that you're going to have witnesses? They're now going to have to come into the facility. And so I think that on one level, it makes sense to say, okay, let's look at this. And actually, I'm going to. I do think, again, this is my initial gut reaction. That's not to say I wouldn't look at it and talk to the commissioner and say, what do you think? But my initial reaction is it's just not something that would flow very well.
Yeah.
In practicality.
Well, maybe we better go to night court. It's coming back.
We have,
The series is coming back.
all you see on NBC is that advertisement.
But, you know,
If I could say one thing in closing, very quickly, when a commissioner talks about working together with ourselves, I would note that it's, whether it's Commissioner Demo, myself, John Campbell, Matt Valeria, the different stakeholders, when we have issues, we try to talk about them. And sometimes we don't always see the results right away. But my hope is when, for instance, Commissioner Demo contacts us or someone contacts us in the judiciary and says, there is this issue. And yes, there are times when I get those emails, I go, yep, we dropped the ball on that one. My hope is that it's a one-time deal. In other words, that we fix the issue and move forward. So I can assure you that, as Commissioner Demo said, we are constantly working to try to address these issues. And if there's any questions in the future, please let me know.
thank you very much. We're going to take a break until 10:15, and then we'll hear from restorative justice statistics.